Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio here. It's content week. We got a ton to talk about as Indiana, Ohio State, Big Ten championship game coming up, and I can't wait. I can't believe we've still got 5 days until this game gets underway, and it's exciting on a number of levels, and we wanted to kick things off in a not dissimilar fashion to how we kicked things off last year when these two teams matched up. We've got Stefan Krajisnik from Cleveland.com joining us on the show. What's the podcast you do, Stefan? Remind me of the name again.
Buckeye Talk.
Buckeye Talk, also from Buckeye Talk. Stefan has joined us before. We're happy to have him back. And we're going to talk about all things Indiana, Ohio State, one of many podcasts we're going to do throughout the course of the week. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and it's sale season at Homefield. We have the Black Friday sale going. We have the Cyber Monday sale going. You can still get 30% off at Homefield Apparel. A lot of great stuff is not in the store right now because it was purchased by sports fans like yourselves, but there's plenty more out there, and whatever team you root for, you're going to find what you're looking for there. It's a really remarkable set of items. We talked about this on CrimsonCast proper a couple of days ago, and talked about how Homefield rolled out some not commemorative per se, but they rolled out a commemorative Battle for the Big Ten hoodie and long sleeve T-shirt and crew neck. That's all on the site right now. They had a commemorative Old Oaken Bucket 66-0 shirt. I mean, they've been just absolutely churning new content for IU football out. Let me get this Battle for the Big Ten shirt up here. I want to show the people what this looks like. For those of you watching on YouTube or on Spotify, a little added bonus for you. There you go. Look at that. That's going to be a collector's item right there. And they've still got sizes available, which is a bit surprising because they didn't have many sizes available for any of the other stuff that I went in and ordered because everybody bought it already. But now you can see and hear about it and use the Cyber Monday code and get yourself a discount at Homefield Apparel. Go to homefieldapparel.com, follow them on the socials, and get yourself outfitted properly, especially if you're going to Indianapolis this weekend, whether or not you're going into Lucas Oil Stadium or not. Also, just a reminder, we are brought to you by Posh Hotel Bloomington, the finest in luxury accommodations. You're staying there, right, on Cleveland.com's dime this weekend, Steph? Is that right?
Sure, why not?
Yeah. So, but no, the Posh Hotel on Kirkwood Avenue, corner of Kirkwood and Washington, the finest in luxury accommodations. Great views of Bloomington, both facing campus and facing the square. An amazing bar, the Kurt Signetti room, an infrared sauna. There's not an infrared sauna in the Kurt Signetti room yet, but we'll see. We'll see what they do down the line. But check them out, poshhotelbloomington.com. Also follow them on Instagram. We're happy to have them aboard as a sponsor as well. All right, Stefan, last time we talked in a professional capacity was, believe it or not, only 54 weeks ago as we got ready for Indiana versus Ohio State in what I'm going to call the first battle of Indiana and Ohio State in the modern era of Indiana football, as Kurt Signetti had his team, I think, 5th in the CFP standings. They had a bye week. They were coming off a huge win against Michigan. They had a chance to get healthy. They scouted Ohio State. They traveled to Ohio Stadium, and they played great in the first quarter, and then Ohio State absolutely dominated them for the final 3 quarters of play, mostly due to Indiana's inability to move the ball, a lot of special teams miscues, and an overwhelming amount of talent, what it felt like, and a disparity between the two teams in that game. It was really the first time that Indiana had really had its nose bloodied in that 2024 season, and it became part of a narrative that ended up getting extended a few weeks later when Indiana played at Notre Dame and had a very similar experience to what they faced in Columbus. So I wanted to start by talking about the distance that's occurred in the 53 weeks since that game happened. It's hard to believe, as you and I were talking before this show, that it's only been 53 weeks. But this is not this matchup this weekend is not the plucky upstart versus the established power. Ohio State, still an established power, won the national title last year, undefeated regular season. Indiana, however, also an undefeated regular season, and they did it winning at Oregon, winning at Iowa, winning at Penn State, blowing out Illinois. They've done it in such a manner that these are, by every statistical measure, FPI, S&P Plus, the AP poll, these are the clear two best teams in the country facing off as number one versus number two in Lucas Oil Stadium. It's hard to believe, as hard as that game last year was to believe that we were there and we had two top 10 teams, it's harder for me to believe that we're going into this game with this being the setup between these two teams.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. But that home field battle for the Big Ten shirt, I'm glad you showed me that before this podcast airs, because I'm going to go get a shirt before those sizes start to go away. So thank you for the heads up on that. I had not seen that shirt yet. But it is fascinating how far it feels like we've come, even after having a top 5 matchup last year, right? It just feels like it's different this year. And I think a result of that is the fact that, Indiana was very successful last year. We all saw what they did, but there was kind of that element of a program that had just never been on that stage before, with the first-year coach. And it just felt like you're probably sitting there watching these games and be like, okay, at some point the fun has to stop, right? Like at some point the fun has to stop. And it never really did. And you kind of felt like it was coming. And then, eventually against Ohio State and Notre Dame, you saw that. This year it's been different because Indiana's been a bit more tested and showed that it could stack up with teams that are more talented or, quote unquote, more talented than them. And I think the Penn State game is a big example of that because everyone points to that and says, why did Indiana struggle so much on the road against this bad Penn State team? Yada, yada, yada. We saw that Indiana can go up against these highly, recruited players and these 4 and 5 stars, these talented teams, and be able to stack up with them and find a way to win at the end of the game. And obviously Oregon and Iowa fall into that batch as well. And the biggest thing, I think, no questions asked, is the trenches, right? That's where Ohio State really dominated that game. I think back to last year in Ohio State's run to a national title, it wasn't always a dominant run to winning a national championship. They lost at Oregon, and there were some serious questions about Jim Knowles and that defense and what they were running and what they were doing, and all of that came with that. And Saban had called that defense antiquated, and they had done a traditional 4-man rush, and they weren't doing enough to disguise look and things like that. And the Indiana game was the first time post Oregon that their defense kind of went up against one of those elite offenses in college football, and we saw, oh, this is what Jack Sawyer can do. This is what JT Tuimoloau can do. This is what Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton, Cody Simon, Sonny Styles, all these guys, what they can do, to get pressure on a quarterback. And then you look at their playoff run, and that's where they dominated, right? Was in the trenches, especially their defensive lineup against opposing offensive lines. That's the biggest difference we have here. I think about the Illinois game. That was, Indiana's game against Illinois was during an Ohio State bye week, and I went to it, and I remember walking out of that game just being like, look at Tyreek Tucker, dude. Like, look at what Kamara's doing. Obviously, we knew Kamara maybe a bit more, but it was just like, and then you saw what, guys like Fisher and Jones and everything up front just looked so different. Like, I remember walking out of that thinking to myself, I don't know what to think of Illinois, but I know that Indiana defensive line, and then, a couple weeks later, we saw the Indiana offensive line against Oregon's defense. That's where they've made the biggest changes. And I think that's why you can point to this game and say they can hang with Ohio State because they are better in the most important area of the field.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because everybody had some question marks about whether Indiana was going to be able to restock. And certainly for the folks that have listened to this podcast throughout the course of the year, those got answered early. I mean, the Illinois game and the Iowa game and the Oregon game happening back to back to back. I don't think anybody thought Indiana had a real shot at winning all three, except for if they had actually reloaded, that would be where it showed up. And that's exactly where it showed up. And especially the Illinois game and the Oregon game, the penetration that the defensive line especially was able to get on Illinois' offensive line, I think, has been pretty suspect throughout the course of the year. Oregon's has not been. And the story from that game was how dominant Indiana's defense was in getting to Dante Moore as many times as they did and really just completely disrupting their offense. Now, they have not had quite the same level of disruption ability over the course of the last half of the season, but they've also gone up against a lot of teams that either haven't passed the ball as much or in Penn State's case, I think had the physicality to match up. I've been saying since this matchup got announced that it's certainly one of those situations where the line play on both sides is really going to determine what happens in this game, because for Ohio State, it hasn't been the same level of offensive line dominance that we saw out of them in the past. It's a different setup. And then defensively, obviously, Patricia's defense has been incredibly good this year. But Indiana is an interesting case study in that they are, at their best, an offense that's got the kind of dynamic, multifaceted approach between the passing game and their effectiveness in the running game that Ohio State hasn't necessarily faced a lot throughout the course of this season. And I think that that's an interesting thing to think about going into this kind of a game, because it's good. These games generally get dictated by how well or how poorly a quarterback gets protected and how easily a running back can get out into space. With Ohio State, so much of what they do is predicated in the passing game, and teams have not been able to get a lot of pressure on Julian Sayin, and he's been able to leverage those receivers incredibly well. So let's maybe start with that. Like, when you look at what Indiana's been able to do defensively so far, and you look at what Ohio State does in terms of their line play, like, how do you think those things match up at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think Indiana's got a chance to maybe put some pressure on Julian Sayin that we haven't seen a ton of. I will say, you're asking me 2 days removed from maybe the most dominant offensive lineman performance we've seen in the Ryan Day tenure and what they did against Michigan. Now, obviously, there's added motivation, and the offensive line is always challenged when they're going against Michigan and playing with something to prove. It's a unit that has been good and kept Julian Sayin upright, but there's areas to attack them, and it starts with the right side of the offensive line from Julian Sayin's perspective, the right guard and the right tackle. Right tackle Philip Daniels has been pretty good. You might remember the name. He spent time in Minnesota before he transferred to Ohio State. And next to him is Tegra Shabola, the right guard. He's kind of been the inconsistent piece, for Ohio State throughout the last couple of years, to be quite honest. Last year in the playoff, they had injuries that forced them to move things around on the offensive line, but also they rotated at right guard as well, just because they felt like the best version of Tegra Shabola was maybe 40 snaps of Tegra Shabola, and having someone else rotate and give another 20. Now, he played a full 73, I think it was, against Michigan, and looked pretty good. But every time we've seen him play pretty well, the next week or the week after, it's been inconsistent. And there's been guys, that have been able to get pressure on Julian Sayin because of that, or make an impact in the run game because of that. So I'm interested to see what Indiana does, not just with, its traditional, defensive front along the defensive line, but also with guys like Fisher and Jones, and moving them around and maybe trying to attack right guard and right tackle a little bit to see if they can force some issues there. But what I'm interested the most with this Indiana defense against this Ohio State offense, and, Jeremiah Smith and Cardinal Tate, they were back for the Michigan game, so they seem to be healthy and ready to go. And you throw in Brandon Innes, the slot receiver, and Max Clear, the transfer tight end from Purdue, and all the weapons that they have. I think there's no denying that.
No.
This Indiana secondary, it's very hard to hold up against those receivers, whoever you are. But when you have a guy like D'Angelo Pons, it adds a whole nother element. Because if you have a guy who can somewhat shut down, and I use shut down in loose terms, right? I'm not saying that these receivers are going to walk out of Lucas Oil Stadium with 0 receptions and 0 targets because of what D'Angelo Pons did. But he played really well last year defensively against these receivers. And I'm wondering, do you go maybe one-on-one with him against the Cardinal Tate and say, we'll use 2-3 guys over here to slow down Jeremiah Smith? Or do you even try, saying, hey, we trust Pons with a little bit of safety help against Jeremiah Smith, and we can dedicate some more to Cardinal Tate? It's just, when you have a guy like that, It changes everything. There's not a ton of those guys that Ohio State has faced this year, or even the last couple of years, that have been able to say, hey, we can shut down, a receiver with this corner and have a few other guys focus on the other elements. So that's where I think the secondary is really interesting, because when you have a corner like that, it can change the dynamics a lot. And Ohio State hasn't seen a ton of that this year.
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating thing, because obviously Pons has been one of the highest graded corners in the country. I think he's 5th on PFF right now, but he's going up against the 5th and 7th ranked wide receivers in the country in Tate and Smith. I mean, it's a tremendous challenge. Now, what's going to be fascinating, Indiana they've been very comfortable in the zone coverage that they've thrown out there, and they've really relied on this secondary group, which coming into the year was viewed as a weakness or a potential weakness outside of Pons. They've relied on them to clean up a lot, and they've gotten burned a couple of times. They got burned deep in that Illinois game that you were at. They got burned deep in the Oregon game. They've had a couple of busts that have resulted in touchdowns, but what's been interesting is it has not been something that opposing offenses have been able to exploit more than once, and most of the time it's like a communication issue with one of the safeties trying to figure out who's supposed to drop in coverage on deep streak routes or whatnot. And so I'm really fascinated because I think ultimately a lot of it comes back to, can Kamara, Tucker, Stephen Daly, can they get the pressure on Julian Sayin to take half a second off of his time in the pocket? His accuracy has been so impressive, and a lot of that has been an ability to sit in the pocket and really pick where he wants to make the throws and make them at the times that he wants them. As good as surprisingly good as we've seen this IU secondary play, they're going to get picked apart if they don't get pressure from the front four. And I'm also curious, like, how do they end up leveraging the linebackers within this structure? What do they end up doing? Where are they, is Aiden Fisher dropping back? How much are they having to respect the run? So there's all these different elements, but yeah, I'm with you in that they're going to probably have to pick a poison when it comes to the Ohio State receiving core and the passing game. You may be very well right that that's what they end up doing. I'm just really interested to see what they end up coming out and trying to address. And, I think we'll know very early whether or not Indiana's defense is up to the task. I will note that Indiana's defense was not really the problem last year against Ohio State.
Yeah.
It's easy to lose sight of it, and a lot of Ohio State fans in particular have, rightfully just kind of gloated over the final score. But if you go back and you think about the way that game went, Indiana's defense only allowed 17 points in like actual game time action. There was a meaningless touchdown at the end out of a victory formation, which I refuse to count against Indiana's defense. And then 14 points were directly attributable to special teams errors by Indiana, one on the drop punt by James Evans and the other one on the punt return that happened early in the third quarter. I mean, that's a pretty good performance against what was a different Ohio State offense, but one that was perhaps superior to the offense that Ohio State's going to be rolling out, even with the two targets that they have on the ends being as good as they are.
Yeah, I mean, the slot receiver was Emeka Egbuka, who is now like potentially the offensive rookie of the year in the NFL, right? And I think Brandon Ennis has been really good, but he's not that. So yeah, I remember Ryan Day after that game kind of talking about not being thrilled with the way the offense played, and kind of looking back at that game after he said that, because you see the score and you're like, that's kind of odd to win a top 5 game and have your coach say that. But then you look at the numbers, and yeah, Indiana's defense, played pretty tough against them, and did a good job of limiting those receivers as much as they could. And then it was one of those things where you kind of glossed over. And then the following week, Ohio State's offense really struggled against Michigan and ended up losing that game. And you're telling yourself, like, yep, maybe this is something that we should have paid more attention to, in that win against Indiana. So I think Ohio State has also slowed it down the way they played, right? They're not trying to win games necessarily by scoring 70 points. I think they've kind of been able to ride their defense a bit when they've taken opportunities. And that's an interesting part of this, is that if Indiana's offense can do some things and maybe force Ohio State's defense to feel a bit of pressure, I'm not saying that they won't be able to execute. I'm not saying that Julian Sayin and Jeremiah Smith and those guys won't be able to win some reps, but it's not something that they've had to face a ton of this year, right? I think Curt Cignetti on Sunday, when the coaches had their pressers, with the Big Ten, talked a bit about Ohio State not being challenged a ton. And I don't think that was him saying, hey, they haven't played anyone, or this is a team that can't handle, tight game in the fourth quarter. I think he's just pointing out that they've been dominant, and none of these games have been particularly close, for the most part, where if you're Indiana, you want to put them in that spot and see how they respond and say, hey, Julian Sayin, you haven't had to have a fourth quarter drive to win a game necessarily yet this year, right? Or at least not, since the Texas game or early in the season. So I think that's a interesting part of this. Of if Ohio State if Indiana can replicate their defensive performance from a year ago, you get a couple points going on offense, you keep Fernando Mendoza upright, and you got a chance to make this thing much more interesting than it was last year.
Just in case there are people that are going to question these numbers, Ohio State, that was their third worst passing performance of the whole season last year in terms of yards. They passed for 175 yards against Michigan. They passed for 182 yards in the game at Penn State last year, and they passed for 201 yards against Indiana. So it's interesting to me because it has kind of gotten lost to the sands of time that was a bit of a struggle. And even, frankly, even running the ball, that was a game that they somewhat struggled in, only 115 yards on the ground for Ohio State in that game. The only games they had a lower rushing total in the regular season were Nebraska and Michigan, both famously games where they struggled in terms of their blocking. They struggled with a good defensive line and a good front six, front seven. So
that was also Travion Henderson broke that run before the last touchdown. So I mean, they were probably under 100 yards until that point.
That's a great point. I hadn't even thought about that. But yeah, you figure that last run was a 39-yard run. And so you take that out, and now you're talking about 30. Not only would that have dropped Ohio State under, I'm terrible at doing math on the fly, but that would have given them 76 yards rushing on 28 carries, which is a pretty bad rush yards per carry average. And it would have dropped them to about 275 yards of total offense, which is a pretty subpar day at the office for Ohio State under any circumstances. So, and this is where I'm very fascinated by how this goes, because you assume you lose a James Carpenter, a CJ West, some of the other players that Indiana lost on defense, that you're going to take a step back. And yet Indiana's defense has been so dominant this year. We've talked about it on our show quite a bit so far this season, but there have only been 2 games so far this year where Indiana has allowed more than 14 points to be scored. And again, like in the Penn State game, 7 of those points came right after a Fernando Mendoza interception in his own end. And in the Oregon game, there was the one busted coverage that they had that led to that touch. Or sorry, I'm not even thinking about the busted coverage. The pick 6 that Mendoza throws at the beginning of the fourth quarter. If you take those 2 out, they've got one 17-point game allowed in Penn State, and then the rest of them are at 14 points or less. That's a pretty good season for a defense.
Yep. It's been awesome watching that defense. And yeah, I think those up front have helped a ton with that. And I thought, actually, I mean, you say those numbers there. I remember thinking in real time that the Indiana defensive line had kind of done their part. That was an interesting point in the season. Is you remember going into the Indiana game, Ohio State had lost their center, right? So that was going to be kind of the big test. And I thought Indiana kind of gave them some challenges. So, coming into this year, I thought maybe that would actually, as much as I thought Indiana improved on the offensive line, I thought maybe they were going to take a step back on the defensive line. That hasn't been the case. There's a lot of guys on this Indiana defense to love. I cannot get enough of Tucker. Like I remember the way he played in the Illinois game, just the energy that he plays with. That dude is a joy to watch.
He really is great. No, Tucker's been awesome. I mean, there's a lot of great stories. Pons is obviously great. Aiden Fisher, we already knew was great, but Isaiah Jones has emerged. And Lewis Moore, who, was at Ole Miss last year. People didn't think he was going to be eligible. He didn't get fully eligible until the end of September. He just keeps picking passes off left and right. They've been very opportunistic in the way they've played defense. And it's been that's been a unit that's kept Indiana in games until their offense has figured things out. And that's such a huge part of winning games like this. I mean, I've had several Ohio State fans in my mentions online, the nice ones, saying like, we think this is going to be a low scoring game because both of these defenses are so good. And I think that the numbers bear that out over the course of the season. People talk about Texas Tech's defense, and rightfully so. These defenses stack right up with that, but they have great offenses to go along with them.
Yeah. These 2 defenses are forces, and they make it. There's an element to this game too that you talk about being opportunistic. Whichever team benefits from a turnover or something like that, like it has to turn into points. I think about Michigan this past week, and Bryce Underwood opening drive, they get down the field and they get a field goal. Julian Sayin's second pass is intercepted, and everyone's telling themselves like, "Oh no, here we go again with the game." And then they get that pick in Ohio State territory, and they only get 3 points out of it. And it's like you just did all of this against this Ohio State team, and it's 6-0. And it kind of felt at that point like, yeah, Ohio State's losing, but that was Michigan's opportunity. And I think that's where if this Indiana defense can force some mistakes, force Julian Sayin to throw an interception, or maybe you draw a ball loose or something like that, it's going to be very important for Indiana's offense to take advantage because, like you said, if this is a low-scoring game, if you get favorable field position or something like that, you have to capitalize on it. And it feels like that for both sides.
Oh, yeah, totally. And that's ultimately kind of what broke the game open last year was the fact that Ohio State ends up getting possession in very favorable territory, and they capitalized on it right before half, and that was essentially it. Like Indiana didn't have another button to push at that point. Speaking of that, let's flip sides and let's talk about Indiana's offense going up against this Ohio State defense. This has been a surprise, I guess, to a lot of national folks that this Matt Patricia coordinated defense has performed so well, given how much we heard about Jim Knowles and the surprise of Knowles getting hired away by James Franklin. People were like, really, Matt Patricia, that's who you're going with? And yet it's worked.
I was one of them.
You were one of them. And yet it's worked amazingly for Ohio State throughout the course of this season. For our fans here in the IU side of things, what has been the secret sauce for this Ohio State defense this season?
A bunch of dudes who didn't play last year because Jim Knowles didn't rotate a ton, and meaning that those dudes probably should have played more football for Ohio State last year. I think that looking at this roster coming into the year, there were a lot of names that, those of us who cover Ohio State and see through the recruiting and stuff like that, that we knew these guys have a chance to be pretty good, right? And it's not a bold take of me to say that, hey, Ohio State had this 5-star and we thought he was going to be pretty good when he had the chance. Like, it's not, but we thought, especially with Texas being your week 1 opponent, that maybe this would be an Ohio State defense that got better as the year went on. And by the time we got to December, where we are now, then we'd see it in full form. And then the Texas game happened, and it was like, oh, so Arron Reese is already an All-American Butkus level player. Like, Jermaine Matthews is already one of the best one of the best corners in the country. Jalen McClain, playing as safety alongside Caleb Downs, like this guy's ready to replace Lathan Ransom, who was an NFL draft pick. The guys up front, Caden Curry is a name that Indiana fans might know. He's from Center Grove, and he actually talked today about how Tom Allen had, kind of recruited him, and he liked Tom Allen, but Ohio State came calling, and he went to Ohio State. These are a bunch of guys that they were kind of behind the scenes, right? Backups who played a good bit, but weren't getting near the level of reps that maybe they thought they should have been getting. What was it going to look like when they got into form? And immediately week 1, it looked dominant. And I think that's what's been the most surprising part is that this hasn't, yes, they have developed, but I think we all thought there would be this curve with this defense, and it just hasn't been the case. They got dudes all over the place, and Arron Reese is the secret to it. Number 8 on the defense. He's a linebacker, but he's being projected as the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. Now we'll see, obviously, if the Jets are picking first overall, I'm sure a guy like Fernando Mendoza is a lot more enticing than, an edge rusher / linebacker. So we'll see what happens. But Micah Parsons is the comparison that he's getting, right? And I think that's kind of been a whole nother thing unlocked, is that last year's team was so traditional 4-man rush. You try to get pressure with your defensive ends, and the guys up front kind of plug things up. And now it's pre-snap. Quarterbacks have to find out where is number 8. And he's often lining up kind of at defensive end, but you have no idea what he's going to do. He could drop back. He could, rush the passer. He could kind of loop and come through the middle and try to get after the quarterback. And that's just a whole nother element that they didn't have last year. They tried – Jim Knowles tried to do this thing. They called it the Jack. I know I think Tom Allen – didn't they call it the Husky when Tom Allen was there?
I think that's right. Yes, it's funny. I hear the Jack, and I'm immediately taken back to my arena football broadcasting days when that's one of the names they give to the linebackers. But yeah, that's correct.
And they try to do something like that where someone's a linebacker, but they're really an edge rusher, and you never know where he's going to be on the field. They've done that with Arron Reese, and it's been really impressive. Kind of the breakout player that he's been. He's a guy that we thought, okay, this will be his first year starting. He'll be pretty good next year. And now it's like, well, he's a junior and NFL teams are about to give him a massive contract, so he ain't coming back. And then you match that with Caleb Downs and what he is defensively. And he's another guy that, like, you go through his PFF, it's crazy because his snap counts in the box, in the secondary, at nickel, he'll line up along the defensive line. Those two guys are, like, they call Caleb Downs the kind of the queen of the chessboard from Patricia. They're both kind of like that. And that's what's made this defense so difficult this year compared to last year is there's an element of unpredictability that last year's defense didn't have. You knew more often than not it was going to be a four-man rush with those defensive ends and the defensive tackles. Not to say it was easy to stop, right? All four of those guys got drafted.
Right.
But, like, the way quarterbacks have talked about this Ohio State defense, it's like they're seeing ghosts because they're like, all right, pre-snap, every time I've seen Arron Reese in this position, he's dropped back in coverage, so we're good. And then it's like, why is Arron Reese taking me down to the ground right now on a two-step drop? And that was the fascinating part about talking to Fernando Mendoza this week is, he talked about the difficulties of identifying pre-snap what Ohio State's going to do, specifically with Arron Reese and Caleb Downs, and then post-snap adjusting because what you thought was going to happen is not at all what actually happened. And that's where I think the Fernando Mendoza aspect is very fascinating in all of this. They haven't played a ton of good and experienced quarterbacks. They played Bryce Underwood, played Demond Williams at Washington. Arch Manning, week one of this season, was not an experienced quarterback. Like,
the one guy who matches that criteria is the one guy that threw for over 200 yards against him, and that was Luke Altmaier.
Luke Altmaier, yep. And that was what I thought was interesting going into that Illinois game too. So this is going to be fun to watch. Fernando, I think he's probably the smartest quarterback in college football. Listening to him do his presser this week was fascinating. It was a Zoom call. He literally was introduced and was like, please give us your opening statement and we'll open it for question. And in the most Fernando Mendoza way possible, he waves, the awkward like Zoom wave.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, hey, everyone. He goes, hi, I'm Fernando Mendoza. I'm the quarterback of Indiana football. It's like, dude, you're Heisman favorite. We all know who you are. Like, it was such like, there's a Kelly School of Business professor. Maybe it's Katie's sitting there nodding her head being like, we bred that. That's what we do here. Is they know how to answer the Zoom call. He's so smart. And that's something that Ohio State hasn't seen a ton of at quarterback. That combination of uber talented, but also experienced and knows how to read things, as well as anyone. That is the chess match here between Shanahan and Patricia. Of Fernando Mendoza can diagnose, but you can also throw a million things at him to have to diagnose. That's what's going to be fun to watch here.
Yeah, I am fascinated. I mean, there's certainly been a bit of a book that's been written about, okay, if you can get heavy pressure going, and Penn State was able to do that, and they really managed to do some things that disrupted Indiana's passing game. Mendoza only passed for 218 yards, and 87 of those yards or whatever, 80 of those yards came on the last drive of the game. He's yet to have against an FBS opponent an overwhelmingly great passing game from a yardage perspective. The closest is probably the Michigan State game. He also threw for 300 yards and 4 touchdowns against Wisconsin. I guess that counts. But so much of what Indiana has done offensively that's made them so dominant offensively has been their running attack. And this to me is the most fascinating plot line in all of this, is that Indiana's averaging 5.63 yards a carry. They've rushed for 2,757 yards and 29 touchdowns. They've rushed for triple digits in every game except one. They've rushed for 300 plus yards in 6 of the 12 games that they've played so far this year. And you contrast that with Ohio State, who's allowed 2 games in triple digits. One of them was Michigan, who got exactly 100 yards. One of them was Texas, who had 166 yards. Everybody else has been double digits, and the per carry average on the season is 2.77 yards against Ohio State's defense. I am really impressed that Ohio State's been able to keep opponents' passing games and running games down. But I'd argue this is by far the best running attack that Ohio State's probably faced all season. To me, that's what will give Fernando Mendoza time to find Elijah Surratt, Omar Cooper Jr., Charlie Becker, E.J. Williams, whoever is out there in the receiving core. They've got to get the running game going, or I don't know that the passing game is going to be able to unlock the running game for Indiana. It's going to have to be the other way around.
Yeah, and that's an interesting element to this because Michigan and Texas are also the only two teams on the schedule that have been able to keep games relatively close to where they could keep running the ball, right? Like Texas, once they were down 14-0, maybe felt like they had to scramble a bit, but that was a one possession game for a lot of it where they could kind of keep, trying to get things going in the running game. Michigan had, you read the stat that they had exactly 100 rushing yards. Michigan in the first half had 108 rushing yards. They had -8 rushing yards in the second half, and a lot of that was also, Jordan Marshall got hurt. He came out and didn't see a ton of him in that game. But also, it was time for Bryce Underwood to have to make some throws because they were losing the game. And Bryce Underwood doesn't particularly look like someone yet who's ready to make some throws in the biggest moments. So it is kind of that cat and mouse game a little bit where Indiana needs its defense to kind of keep that game close, so Indiana doesn't feel like it has to, necessarily throw the ball. But that is an area where Ohio State's been very good, but it hasn't been tested a ton. They haven't faced a ton of elite running backs this year. And we saw Michigan kind of poke some holes in that early in the game. And it's interesting now to see, can Indiana maybe burst, through the line a bit and get some, big plays in the run game? Because if they do and the game's close, that's something that they can lean on as the game goes on. That's probably the one area where statistically Ohio State has been dominant, but anecdotally, maybe there are some opportunities that teams have taken advantage of and had some big plays, right? I think, Washington didn't do much against Ohio State, but Jonah Coleman was able to break, one run. I think it was like 30, 40 yards, something like that. And I trust Indiana, and its running backs to maybe do it a bit more often than some of the teams on Ohio State's schedule. So if Indiana can get its run game going and its defense can keep Ohio State out of the end zone so that Indiana can keep running it, I think that is an area where maybe they can, have some success, and people will say at the end of the day, oh, that Ohio State defense, like maybe that is their flaw, right? And that's what's interesting is, I talked about Caden Curry, how good he is. On the other side of the defensive line, Kenyatta Jackson, he's a great pass rusher, but we've seen teams try to run at him a little bit. That's 97 on the defense. So I would imagine pretty early on, Shanahan is going to tell Mendoza in that rushing attack to, go to that side, go toward 97 and see if you can maybe break a couple things and try to get the run game going. I agree with you. I'm very anti you have to establish the run because you can also get some passes going and open up the run game. And I think, especially covering Ohio State, the problem against Michigan is that establish the run. It's like, that's not who you are. That's why you keep losing to Michigan until this year. But if you're Indiana, it does feel important to some level have some success in a run game in order for your offense to open itself up a bit.
I want to talk about the non-football aspects of this particular game in a second, but one last thing I want to discuss with you in comparison to the game that happened last year between these two teams is that game was at Ohio Stadium. It drizzled just enough in the second quarter that it made the ball slick, which might have been why James Evans dropped the ball. It certainly affected the passing game for both teams. Will Howard threw an interception in that game. Curtis Rourke was off a bit. A lot of that was then pressure-driven as it went along. What, in your opinion, and we don't know what the crowd is going to look like necessarily for this game, but what, in your opinion, is the difference in how the game might go, given that it's not in Ohio Stadium, but is instead in a neutral site venue that's in Indiana's state and could have a lot of IU fans there, might even have a majority IU. We don't know. It could be that Ohio State does their normal thing and comes in and buys all the seats, but it also might be more of an IU crowd than an Ohio State crowd. How do you interpret what sort of impact that might have on this game compared to what we saw last year?
Yeah, I think huge, right? Because I doubt, even if it is majority Ohio State, it won't be 100-0 like it was last year. So I doubt Indiana has to go to a silent count or anything like that, right? Because Mike Kadick has been very open about how difficult that was to do last year and the troubles that caused for Indiana. We talked to Luke Montgomery, the left guard for Ohio State on Monday, and he talked about how, they're thinking it's going to be a 50-50 crowd, but they're preparing like it's a true road game, right? So I'm sure there's going to be some crowd noise and things like that at Ohio Stadium. At Ohio State's practices. I think it's going to be a big factor, right? I think that was something that it all kind of snowballed for Indiana at the same time. It felt like last year where Ohio State started throwing some punches. At the same time, you kind of felt like you had to go to a silent count, and it felt like a team that wasn't quite ready for that stage and that environment yet. And between the guys that have come back from last year's team, paired with the veteran talented guys that have added to the roster, like a Fernando Mendoza, it just seems like it's a team that's more apt for the moment. And I think Cignetti's kind of been open about that. I thought his comments on Sunday, my coworker Stephen Means asked him basically like, did that game at Ohio Stadium tell you, hey, we're good, but like we're not there yet? And Cignetti was open about how humbling of an experience that was and how much they feel like that game and the Notre Dame game have made Indiana a better team in 2025. I think fans who watch Indiana probably agree with that, and you can see the difference. So all that to say is, all of that is a massive difference. You're asking, You're asking a team that's not as good to go into a brutal environment against the number one team in the country, or the team that ended up winning the national championship. And this year, you're asking a better team to go into a less hostile environment and compete in it, without weather being much of a factor. It feels like it's night and day, what Ohio State or what Indiana had to deal with last year compared to what they're going to deal with this year.
Well, and look, I was at that. I've been to every Cignetti era game except one in person, and the difference between the way the team reacted in that Ohio State game and in the Notre Dame game. And you're right, Kadix talked about it and just how kind of overwhelming that environment was. But the difference between that and what they did at Iowa and what they did at Oregon, like those two games specifically, you can see the growth and the mentality differences and just the ability to react in difficult environments that really did, it seemed like, forge Indiana. I mean, I was shocked in the best possible way at how well Indiana handled Autzen, a stadium that's notoriously difficult to play in and even harder to win in. And they were the dominant team. They only won by 10, but they could have won by 17. It was that level of superiority over the course of the game. And that's nothing to take away from Oregon. It's more of an illustration of how much Indiana had matured over the course of an offseason. And I agree with you. I mean, I am fascinated to see what the crowd's going to look like. The tickets, Stefan, are an apocalypse right now.
Someone had asked me, I got asked earlier this week, are you upset that you have to cover and work while your alma mater is playing for the first time in the Big Ten championship game? And I responded by saying, I would not be watching this game if I was not credentialed for this game. So I am very okay covering this game because those ticket prices tell me that I probably would not be in the building had I not been credentialed to cover it. So
I mean, this is just one side of the stadium. I don't know how well people can see this. I mean, we're talking about every lower level ticket is in the quadruple digits. Every mid-level ticket, except for the ones kind of over here in the 400 section, are in quadruple digits, except for like the $888 one.
Yeah.
Even the upper level tickets, this is the 600 level of Lucas Oil Stadium, 605, 567, 523, 452, 495. This is nuts. And I'm not sure who's spending that money, who's buying those tickets. I get the feeling it might be slightly more Indiana fans because Ohio State fans have been in Big Ten championships before.
Yeah.
Obviously it's been 5 years since Ohio State's actually won a Big Ten title, but they won a national title last year. Like, I think everybody knows that this is, there's a little bit more, there's a bigger prize even beyond this, especially if you're Ohio State. Not that the players won't take it seriously, but I do wonder if we see the fans coming over in quite the same number as what you'll get for what is essentially an in your backyard game for Indiana and its fan base.
Yeah, I think what's interesting too is that Ohio State has typically been well represented at the Big Ten championship game when they've played there. Their fans also buy tickets ahead of time for the Big Ten championship because they anticipate being there. So the resale being that expensive tells me that there's a lot of Indiana fans that are maybe coming through, the third party here trying to get involved and get some tickets, because I can't imagine there was a ton of Indiana fans in July that were buying Big Ten championship game tickets. Did you? You're the ultimate believer.
Yeah, I did not, because, and actually for the opposite reason, as I've explained on the show before, the level of damage that I've suffered as an IU football fan over the course of time meant that I was worried I was going to curse the team if I bought tickets ahead of time. So of course I did not. It's funny though, because the what's fascinating about it, there was a comment on our Discord, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but a guy was like, I'm friends with this guy that works for a ticket fulfillment company, and they've run out of tickets and are now flipping tickets that they're getting off the secondary market to fulfill the tickets. I mean, this is the level of demand that exists currently. And I have no doubt Ohio State fans are interested in going, but this is, for a lot of IU fans, I think this is one of those once in a lifetime types of opportunities in their brains. It probably won't be the only time in a lifetime. This is probably, the first of maybe at least a couple of times where Indiana will have a legitimate shot to be in the Big Ten championship game. But this is the first time Indiana's been in one of these, and it is absolutely a fever pitch right now for a lot of people, especially since each team only got an allotment of 6,000 tickets to sell their season ticket holders. A lot of people did not get those fulfilled. And so that is a really interesting wrinkle in all of this.
Basketball tickets are starting to get a little bit more expensive too, since Indiana clinched that spot. I noticed that. I saw last week the get-in price at Cambridge was around 80, and now it's triple digits as well. So there's gonna be a lot of Indiana fans in Indianapolis on Saturday. I get that sense. Signetti called it the doubleheader, so it's officially a doubleheader now that Signetti's considered as such. He knows that there's going to be a basketball game.
It's going to be a wild day. Well, let's just maybe kind of wrap up by talking about that aspect of things. Like, this is, for the Big Ten, this has got to be like an unexpected bonanza, in as much as you have Ohio State, who travels as well as any team in the conference. It's like them, Michigan, and Penn State per normal in the Midwest. But so you've got them, and they're going to come out in force. We've seen Ohio State fans travel really well pretty much everywhere. You've got Indiana, who never traveled well for football, but you've got them an hour away from their campus with their basketball team playing, like tipping 6 hours before the football game kicks off. Downtown Indianapolis is going to be an absolute zoo, and it builds a level of anticipation and excitement around this football game that just frankly wouldn't be there with any other team and any other combination of teams. I think, because again, like Indiana and Ohio State, this is not a rivalry. Ohio State is clearly the better team. Ohio State is up to, and I'm talking about historically here, but Ohio State is now up to 29 consecutive wins, I believe, in the series. The last time Indiana won in this series was 1988. The last time they won outside of Bloomington was 1987. And the overall series record is 12-80-5. So Ohio State's won 80 of these out of the, whatever it is, 99 that have been played. So it's I believe the 100th game between Indiana and Ohio State, which
there's a 2010. There's a vacated win in there for Ohio State, so I don't know how that counts.
Well, let's just say it's the 100th game that counts.
Let's do it.
But this is an Ohio State program that Indiana fans need no urging to go out and root against heavily when Indiana is playing. I just find the whole combination of this to be fascinating, and I think it's going to make for an amazing environment, an amazing connection between these two teams, because there's this subtext. Ohio State is the dominant team in the conference, and they have been for many years now. And this Curt Cignetti project that's been going on in Bloomington is well ahead of what what any sane person could have expected the schedule to be on it. And here they are, knocking on the door of national, not just recognition, but like national acceptance as a bona fide football power. I mean, not a dynasty, not a blue blood, but at least a football power. And this is a big step along the way for them. And for Ohio State, this is a chance to, push what they view as the littlest of the little brothers back down where they belong again. I think that will make for a very fascinating respectful but fascinating clash of two programs that are in very different spots in terms of their history, but in very similar spots in terms of how this season has gone.
It's the most fascinating matchup of David versus Goliath because David is actually pretty decent. And he's not quite Goliath, but he's actually pretty good. And like some people might be putting money on Goliath or on David.
This isn't David. This is Dave versus Goliath. You know, a little cooler than David, right?
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting.
Let's put that on a shirt, Homefield. Dave versus Goliath. I like that.
Yeah, we went from Catholics versus convicts to Dave versus Goliath. This is why Homefield doesn't have us do too much stuff for them. We'll shut up and buy the shirts. You make the shirts.
Right.
You know, I think what makes it so interesting is that 2019 was my first year covering Indiana football with the Indy Star. I worked alongside Zach Osterman kind of as a student intern with them. And I remember the start to that 2019 season where they went 3-0 and kind of dominated I think like Eastern Illinois might have been the team that kind of kept the 3-0 start. And they were not playing good teams, right? But their first big game was their first conference game against Ohio State at home. And Ohio State whooped them. The final score was like 50-0 or something like that. It was just terrible. And I remember Zach, kind of talking with me post game and just being like, trying to find some kind of takeaway from this game in terms of a big picture. And it felt like if Indiana was going to take that next step, it couldn't really afford something like that, right? Where it got on a big stage with a good team and just got whooped. And that 2019 team actually ended up being pretty decent for Indiana. And obviously everyone remembers what happened in 2020 and so on. But the test really between being a good team and maybe a better team was, can you keep it tight with a team like Ohio State? Now, obviously that was a loaded Ohio State team with J.K. Dobbins and Chase Young and all that. But could you compete and not just have these games where you show up and it's 30-0 and before the first quarter ends? And it felt like it was a scary place for Indiana football because they were at this crossroads of, will you be more competitive in this games or will you fade? And they ended up being all right, but then we saw the end of the Tom Allen era. And it's just so fascinating to be here now where it's Ohio State isn't the gauge anymore of can Indiana compete with good teams and be respected. Ohio State's now the gauge of can you beat Ohio State and be a national championship contender? And that's where it's so crazy. And I've been telling people, like, I feel like I've covered Indiana versus Ohio State so many times, and yet Saturday it feels like I'm covering a game I never thought I was going to cover. Yeah. Right? To have these two programs competing for a Big Ten title, and then who knows, we might be a month and a half away from these teams meeting in Miami for a chance to play for the national championship. It's crazy how quickly it's all turned. I think there's a lot of Indiana fans that still can't even particularly process it, and probably have some guardrails up, ready for Saturday to be some horrific game where Ohio State humbles them or something like that. Like, I don't think that's where this is right now. And it's a testament to, obviously Signetti and everything they've done there, but also to the players. Like, it's so hard. I've just seen it so many times where these teams come and they play Ohio State, they get punched in the face and their program just does not recover. Like, they don't know what to do with that. And for them to kind of, bounce back the way that they have and move on, from what happened last year against Ohio State and Notre Dame, it's been really, it's commendable, man. It's awesome to see it happen. And for this to be the stage in Indianapolis of all places, Indiana fans deserve this, man. And we'll see what happens on Saturday. And, Ohio State's a loaded team with talent everywhere. And it's certainly going to be a test for Indiana. But what I like about this is that for both teams, and Ohio State included in this too, it's a test for what you're about to see with no consequences.
Right.
This is where what Indiana spent all offseason doing of what happened against Ohio State and Notre Dame. How do we learn from that? That can happen Saturday, and you're given 30 months to say, okay, what can we learn from this, win or lose, to be able to compete against Georgia and Texas A&M and Ole Miss and Texas Tech and all these teams that you're going to see in the playoff. Like, that's such an interesting element of this too. It's an inconsequential, massive test, right? Because you can see for Indiana how you stack up against Ohio State, but Ohio State, this is also the best team that they've played all the year. Indiana's better than Texas. I don't think that's much of a debate. Indiana's better than Michigan and Illinois and Washington. Like, this is Ohio State's biggest test, and win or lose, you have a chance to kind of look in the mirror and say, all right, what do we do wrong, and fix it, because you're going to have 30 days to fix it.
That's the thing. You get that time, and I mean, I think I even saw Bill Connolly mention this as he was previewing the games for this upcoming weekend, where he said, like, even if Indiana loses, they might learn some things that they could use in what might be an inevitable rematch against Ohio State in the playoff. And I think that both teams will probably approach it that way. I'm very convinced Indiana is going to approach the game with a full level of seriousness and planning on going full tilt. And I think Ohio State will as well. For all the talk that we've heard from places about how the game doesn't mean anything, in terms of seeding, it doesn't, I don't think, because both teams have far and away established themselves as the two best teams in the country. And whether one loses to two or two loses to one, unless you get some really out of whack committee chicanery, which is always it's always a possibility. But
I think the SEC champ is going to end up being number 2.
Which,
if it's Georgia,
But you know what? A number 2 seed versus a number 3 seed essentially doesn't mean a whole lot, especially since it's kind of a lot of questionable teams once you get below 4 or 5 right now. But it does feel like whoever the winner is going to the Rose Bowl as the 1 seed, and whoever the loser is going to be maybe the 2, maybe the 3, but probably not the 4, and probably not hosting a game on December 19th or 20th. And so not only do you get the advanced scouting and the psychological readjustment of saying, all right, that's what playing that team is like, you also get 30 days to heal up. You get 30 days if you suffer injuries in this, which you never want to see in games like this, but they almost always happen. You can be a little less concerned about, God, we got to play next week, or God, we got to play in 2 weeks, because you have an extra week and a half before you have to play even beyond that. And that really does make a huge difference.
Yeah. It's kind of, it's a cool setup, right? Because there is so much of the negative talk of like, well, what's the point of this game? All you're doing is risking something bad happening. Like, I don't know, man. There is some good that could come out of this. I've enjoyed the way Ryan Day and Kurt Cignetti have talked about this game, in the sense of Cignetti saying that this is a fan base that's showing up for a doubleheader to watch Indiana do something it's never done before and take part in the Big Ten championship game. Like, if we treat this game like it doesn't matter, it's kind of a disservice to all the people who are spending thousands of dollars literally to come watch this game. And for Ohio State, it's kind of a similar sentiment of, it's 1 versus 2. You haven't been in this game in a while since COVID. And I know Indiana fans have opinions about Ohio State playing in the 2020 Big Ten championship game. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole again.
A couple of opinions, yes.
I remember covering that very well from the Indiana perspective. But it's also, both these teams, like, you're a competitor, you want to be an undefeated national champion. Yeah. Being the first ever team to go 16-0 in the college football ever, and just college football period, not the college football playoff era, to be the first team to ever go 16-0, like, there is something to that. And I don't, like, if you go 16-0, because I think you have to be in a conversation of some level of super team. I know people say 2019 LSU, and it's like, I'll put a gun to your head if you ever say some team could possibly better than 2019 LSU. It's like, I don't know, if one of these teams goes 16-0 and beats 4 top 10 teams in the college football playoff, you get to be part of that conversation. So I think the media is the only people who are talking about this game not actually mattering much. And maybe teams that aren't playing, their fans are looking at this from that perspective. From Ohio State and Indiana, I don't think that's the conversation at all. And I think that's good. I think it makes for a fun environment. I like saying the word environment there. Like, this is going to be awesome. Whatever the crowd split is, I think it's probably going to be pretty close to 50-50. Ohio State fans just travel so well. But then obviously Indiana is going to have such a strong contingent with it being close to Bloomington. But also, we all know how many Indiana supporters there are just in Indianapolis and the area around it. Like, it's going to be one of the cooler things. I don't think College Game Day is going to the best game on the college football schedule this weekend, and we all know why that is. But that's the reality of it. Is it's going to be billed as a massive game. As a reporter, and 8:18 p.m. kickoff isn't necessarily the most fun thing in the world, but it's a night game on prime time under the lights of Lucas Oil Stadium. Gus Johnson, Joel Klatt on the call. It's going to be everything you want for a 1 versus 2 matchup. In those 4 hours that the game is going on, there's not going to be conversations of, hey, let's sit this guy. Let's, unless something pops up, obviously. Like, there's not going to be any of that conversation. I think that's what makes this fun. It's like you have two coaches that are ultra competitors with rosters that have plenty to prove and feel like they have a chip on their shoulder, for whatever reason that is. And it makes for a pretty cool environment on Saturday. I'm really looking forward to it. Like I said earlier, I don't think I, as a reporter or as a student at Indiana, ever thought this was going to happen. And I know there's a lot of people listening to this who agree. And one more thing, Indiana's rise to being one of the, what was Signetti's line? One of the emerging powers in college football.
The emerging superpower in college football.
Yeah. The coolest part of Indiana being the emerging superpower of college football, at least for you and maybe like 3 CrimsonCast listeners, is that I get to be on the pod now once a year and talk about top 5 matchups between Ohio State and Indiana. So amid all this cool environment and big game and 1 versus 2, CrimsonCast listeners get to keep listening to me. So there we go.
It's the literal best of both worlds, Steph. It's amazing. The one little statistical oddity, Indiana, against all past and present Big Ten foes, has current winning streaks against all but 4 of them. Ohio State is obviously one. We talked about it earlier. They've lost. Ohio State's won 29 straight in the series. The other 3 that they don't have active win streaks against. You want to guess who the 3 are?
I'm going to guess USC.
That's one. They do not. They don't have a single win against USC yet as a program.
Okay. I mean, it's got to be all teams on the West.
No.
And USC is the only newcomer. Minnesota?
Yep, that's the second one.
It's not Nebraska. It's not Purdue. It's not Iowa. No, they beat Northwestern. What are the other two? I'm blanking on some teams here.
There's several other teams from the former West, but believe it or not, the other team that Indiana has got a current losing streak against in the series is Rutgers.
Shout out Tom Allen.
Yep. They're on a 3-game losing streak against Rutgers, a 4-game losing streak against Minnesota, a 4-game losing streak against USC, and a 29-game losing streak against Ohio State. So a chance to put that to bed alongside many other things, depending on what happens in this game. It's going to be fascinating. So I can't wait. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. And as you said, this is a matchup between 2 really awesome teams. And I think that, ball knowers, as people say in today's parlance, are really excited about this matchup to see, and I've said this before, like I put a lot of trust in computer rankings and numbers because they do a pretty good job of giving us a good idea of who's good in college football in the absence of more direct evidence. You get direct evidence here, which matters to everybody except the committee when it comes to Notre Dame, but certainly matters a lot, I think, to all of us when we're actually trying to compare teams against other teams. And so I'm really excited that we get to see these 2 teams on a neutral field, which I think is an even better way of judging relative strength of team versus team. It should be a fascinating spectacle, and I'm glad we're going to both hopefully be in the building for it. So I hope you have a safe drive over, and hope the rest of the week goes well for you. And thanks for taking the time to join us on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. By the way, shout out to the Indiana volleyball team. Jared Rigdon, best SID in the country, man. They keep winning.
It's amazing. And Steve Aird and the whole crew over there get to host Thursday and Friday of this week. I was at the watch party for the tournament draw last night. That was amazing. Just a lot of joy in that room. It's been a long climb for this program to get up to the point where it's at. But hosting a sub-regional in any sport in college sports is hard to do. There's only generally about 16 of those in any sport in a given year. And a good draw, I think, for Indiana as well in that. So looking forward to seeing what they're able to accomplish.
Yeah, best turnaround in college sports, Indiana football or Indiana volleyball. I'll let you decide.
I think they both deserve 2 very separate categories, 2 very impressive turnarounds, and couldn't be happier for both programs. And they've made me very happy as well. So,
there you go.
All right, Stefan Krajisnik, Cleveland.com, joining us here on the show. My friend, thank you so much. Enjoyed it. My thanks to all of you folks for tuning in as well. We will have a lot more podcast content throughout the course of the week. So stick with us here on CrimsonCast on the Back Home Network. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.